Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today we're going to unpack some of the things that we think might make the App Store better. And if you were a listener to Developing Perspective, the show I did before this one, you might know that about a year ago, I did a long series, actually it may have been 2 years ago, I did a long series about things that I thought could make the App Store better. And we both kind of make our livings inside of the App Store. And so, as you would imagine, we have a lot of concerns, thoughts, goals, like things we think about in the App Store, because it's a place we spend a lot of time, both as a customer, but also as a producer. It's easy, I think, for us to look at the App Store and to just kind of like whine about it, to look at it and say, oh, I wish it did this, I wish it did that. Like, we all have some kind of like pet things that we think might make it better for whatever the better might mean to us. But it's challenging. It's difficult for us to perhaps to take the sort of like the step back and say, the App Store is the way it is, and whining about that isn't going to change it. We can look at it and we can learn from it. And it's like our job as developers is to understand how we can make a living inside of sort of it as it exists, and hope that Apple is doing things on their end to make it better. But from the outside, it seems like, sometimes when I think about the App Store too much, I start to get sad. And I go and when I'm trying to be a good student of the App Store and understand what's being successful, what's working, I'll go to the top grossing list, which isn't necessarily the most constructive place because that's not really the kind of apps I'm making. But I go there and I look at the top grossing app, which right now as we're recording is Clash Royale. And I go to its IAP list and it's like, what would you like to buy? A fistful of gems, a pouch of gems, a bucket of gems, a barrel of gems, a mountain of gems, or a wagon load of gems.
Wait, is that really what I thought you were joking?
No. That is the list of the top in-app purchases in the top grossing app right now.
Oh, that's so sad.
And it's kind of sad too when I think about I go to WWDC every year. And almost always they'll have, Apple will have a big slide that talks about how much money they've paid out to developers. Last year it was something like $14 billion or something. And rather than that being exciting and encouraging and being yeah, let's do this, guys, it just kind of makes me sad because I look at that number and I just think, well, I guess that's a lot of wagons full of gems. And that's just not great.
Yeah, I mean, that number, outside of any information on the distribution of those stats, the median might be a little more interesting, although honestly it would probably be pretty sad too, just in the opposite direction. But yeah, I mean, when you have these mega hit games that are bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars a day or more, that's roughly what we're talking about here. You could be bringing in millions of dollars a day. From our perspective, it's really easy to look at that and be like, wow, why am I even in the App Store if that's what succeeds? But that's not a very productive way to look at it or encouraging way to look at it. I think a better way to look at it is we aren't even playing the same game as these people, and what we need to be concerned about is there a game that we can play here? Is there a spot for us in the App Store where we can succeed? I think there's enough apps by smaller shops that aren't abusive games like this. There's enough apps that do succeed that the answer to that is almost certainly yes, there is a spot. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's easy to get into one of those spots, although it might not necessarily need to be easy. But that also doesn't mean that Apple's doing everything they can to make sure the rest of the store is healthy besides just that top grossing list. And there's lots of areas, I think, for potential improvement that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and I think it's the thing that motivated, I think, this discussion, why I wanted to sort of talk about it now, is that for the first time in a long time, I feel like there's outward signs that the App Store is going to be changing this year. And most significant of which is Phil Schiller is now taking responsibility for it. Which, I mean, I think Phil is awesome, and that's really encouraging to me. But even just the simple fact of there's a change in leadership there, that there's a change in responsibility, in my mind, can only be good. And I think I'm, encouraged that even Phil has kind of publicly, in a few random sort of tweets or things, when people are bringing to his attention, there's weird issues in the App Store. I'll probably have a link in the show notes to a tweet someone sent him showing a sort of a featured area in the App Store for the puzzle games, and it's just chock full of the 2048 clones. And you kind of have and he, his response to that is that shouldn't happen. We'll look into it. Thank you. And the fact that that kind of thing is even happening at any level makes me encouraged. And so I think we wanted to do for the rest of the episode is to kind of think through what are some things that we would like to see done. Like if we were sitting down in a room with Phil and he was like, as independent developers, what could I do to make the App Store better for you? Like, what would that be? And think through what that would actually be, and things that we could think about that would make the App Store an objectively better place, both as a customer or as a someone who makes their living in it.
So our sponsor this week is TapStream. You've invested months building your app, fought the good fight with Xcode, and have used NSLog more times than you care to admit. Now comes the really ugly part, marketing your app. TapStream is a company built by app makers who were annoyed that the big guys like Zynga and King had in-house marketing tools that gave them an unfair advantage, so they set out to change that. TapStream assists you at every step of the marketing cycle. Start with tracking installs and engagement to understand where to focus your marketing dollars or attention. TapStream will also let you show new users personalized welcome screens that speak directly to them based on the marketing campaign that brought them to your app. These screens are fully edited and controlled from TapStream's online dashboard, allowing you to ask for newsletter signups, give tips, or free in-app currency to users acquired through specific channels. You can easily implement iOS 9.2 style universal deep links in minutes and get to see all the click data associated with each link. TapStream will even let you quickly add a full referral program to your app, getting users to invite their friends and receive rewards for successful installs. As developers, we often bristle when someone mentions marketing, but marketing doesn't have to be a dirty word. TapStream's suite of tools is built for mobile developers by mobile developers. This means they're highly focused on making it the easiest to use platform with tools that can be deployed quickly. You can get started with the SDK in a few minutes and implement any product within an hour. TapStream is offering all Under the Radar listeners a 30-day free trial and, this is a big one, a permanent 50% discount on their Marketing Pro account level. This includes all platform features and products, including analytics, deep links, app invites, and campaign landers. Tapstream.com/UTR for Under the Radar. Once again, that's tapstream.com/UTR. Sign up today. Thanks a lot to TapStream for sponsoring us and all of Relay FM.
All right.
I think that one of the biggest things I'd like to see, I just want to see signs of motion. Signs that Apple believes that this isn't as good as it could be and is willing to take the steps to prioritize real change and experimentation and improvement in the App Store. Because the App Store is now just under 8 years old. For being almost 8, it really has not changed very much from the way it was launched. There have been small improvements here and there, but almost unchanged. The entire industry, Apple included, have we learned nothing since it started? Obviously we've learned something. So I think it's upon Apple to just show that they're willing to make changes over time as we learn what works, what doesn't, what's healthy, what's not. And so far we've seen very little of that. So that's what my number one hope is, not any one particular change, but just I really hope that Apple just shows signs of not being complacent, not thinking that what they have now is the inevitable end and as good as it can get.
I agree. Yeah, and I think seeing, like I said, in some ways it's any change. There are certainly things that, pet things that I would like, and which we'll certainly talk about, but just having a sense that the App Store is going somewhere, and that I could if I look towards my my own personal future of should this be the place that I'm making my living? If it seems like it's going sort of getting worse and worse, or at least sort of has plateaued at a not great level, that's not an encouraging thing to look forward to and to seek to kind of invest my time and energy into, versus something that seems like, even if it's just a slow incremental process of getting better and better, that would be great. That would be encouraging. That would be motivating and something that would be make it feel more worthwhile to put all the the time and attention that I'm putting into the App Store currently.
Yeah, I mean that's because I feel like where it is now is not in a very encouraging place for people like us. Right now we can get by, but it's hard, and there's not a lot of headroom. It doesn't feel like it's on its way up anymore. It feels like it's on its way down, at least for people like us, and it feels like we have fewer and fewer options over time of how to make a decent living in the App Store. A lot of this is just market forces at work here. A lot of this is not within Apple's control to change. By far, the biggest problem in the App Store for indies to get by is just that there's a massive amount of relentless competition, not only for exactly the same things that your apps do. Like, if I release a podcast app, there's already a whole bunch of podcast apps out there. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, anything I do in mine that will be different or noteworthy, other people will be able to do as well. Nothing. I'm not like, I don't have any kind of magical abilities that nobody else can duplicate. Anybody can do the same things I do. And if you have an app that is popular at all, that will happen. Because number three, there are absolutely tons of developers out there. They all are trying to make the same living out of the same pie, and the pie is growing, but so is that pool of developers. And then finally, number four, there are lots of other things competing for everyone's attention all the time on their phones as well. So even if your app does pretty well against other similar apps, you're also competing with literally everything else they have available on their phone, which is everything in the consumer web world right now, basically. So like, you're competing with those top grossing games, or like, instead of listening to a podcast, they could choose to go play Clash or whatever, so like, you are competing with all of those things. Because this is the hot place to be, the level of competition is just immense and ruthless.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was before the show, I went and took a look at just trying to quantify just how big the App Store is and how much it's continuing to even grow. And honestly, at the end of looking at all this, I just had tremendous sympathy for the poor app reviewers, because right now in the App Store, I think I found a couple of conflicting numbers, but the number's somewhere in the ballpark of around 2 million apps. And it seems like they're being added to the store at roughly 2,000 a day. Seems to be the best number I could get kind of looking around, which means that during this show, like during 30 minutes of this show, something like 42 apps will have launched. And that's just new apps.
That's crazy.
That's not even updates. Like, the poor people in app review, I don't even know how how to conceive of the workload that those poor people must have.
Even you can't release apps that quickly.
Even me. I mean, I'm famous for having lots of apps. And I look at this and it's like, how... Like, the first thing that I think that Apple needs to work on is understanding if they're going to do something about that. Early on in the App Store, they used to always get up on stage and talk about, now we have 100,000 apps. Now we have 500,000 apps. Now we have 1 million apps. Like, as though having a big number were something desirous. And in the early stages, maybe it was to say, when they were first building out the App Store, it was an important thing to have lots of apps and to cover all the different goals and things that people might want to do on their phones. But my suspicion is at this point, that of those, say, 2,000 new apps every day, I can't imagine all of them, or at least even the majority of them, are really adding to the platform and making it better and stronger. And puts a tremendous load, I'm sure, on the app review team. And so it means that, like, you and I, when we submit a bug fix update, say, we have some problem in our app, we submit it, we have to wait at least a week to get it reviewed and out into the store. And I gotta imagine some of that is coming from just the sheer volume of junk. And say 2,000 is the right number. It's like 2,000 a day new apps are being approved. Like, what's the number of apps that are getting rejected? Like, it's just gotta, like, there's gotta be things that Apple can do on that end. And I don't know if it's changing the review guidelines, making it so that there's some kind of extra barriers to actually submitting apps to try and make, or being just sort of harsher in app review and having higher standards on sort of a more editorial, opinionated side, to make it so that people get the idea. So sort of very quickly, you would expect that if the process of just sort of putting sort of not high level apps into the App Store became unsuccessful, after a while, people would stop doing that. It would be a waste of time and not really worth the effort, or something. But
yeah, but that's so risky, though. Like, anything they do to try to make subjective judgments, I feel like is just asking for trouble. Because, I mean, they already have a lot of these things now, and they do often get crap for making a bad decision, usually warranted. Anything they do to try to say, like, okay, well, now your app doesn't have to just follow these rules. It also has to be, like, worthy a little to some degree. Sure. Even if it's just a minor degree, this has to be, like, worthy of being included in the store. It has to have value to somebody. And they already define that minimum functionality rule, which is, vague, and that just refers to a level of functionality. What if there was also a level of minimum quality? And again, there have been rules that have kind of alluded to this in the guidelines since the beginning, but they haven't really been enforced very much. The problem, though, is that this isn't just like Phil Schiller making those decisions. This is probably hundreds of employees in app review who all have to be making those decisions constantly, they're not going to be able to kick every one of them up to a manager for approval. So you're going to have to they have to come up with rules that can be consistently enforced with a large staff. The more room for subjectivity there is, the harder it is to achieve consistency. And they already have issues with this. Anything they do to make the rules to basically raise the bar of their minimum quality standards, they're going to get so many more problematic rejections, so much more bad press about problematic rejections, and they're going to have people like us complaining. So it's a hard balance to strike. I don't think they've struck the right balance yet. Certainly raising the bar is challenging.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, and I look at that and it's like, I don't envy how they would make the decision, but it seems like it's either you have to take the approach of like the Google Play Store. Like the bar is like, is this basically functional and not malware? Kind of, at least conceptually. I mean, I'm not a Google Play expert, but the app review process there is much more streamlined and straightforward, at least as best I understand it, where you have very low bars and, you approach the sort of problem almost more on the demand side rather than the supply side. Like you just let anybody who wants to have an app be in the store. If you do that, you just need to build the store itself, like the front end into that, such that users can very easily and quickly get away from things that aren't great and only are driven towards things that are good. Because I think you could probably say like the ultimate goal of the App Store, like if you had to try and boil that down, is that anytime a customer downloads an app, they're getting a good experience. Like that would seem a reasonable goal for what the App Store is trying to do. That a user says, I have a need, or I want to be amused or entertained or whatever it is. And they go to the App Store, that the things that they find there are going to give them a positive experience. And, there's a lot of things that the Apple could do, maybe on the editorial side, to dramatically, improve that structure. Where right now, in the App Store app, like there's the featured area, the top charts area, and the explore area. The featured area, I think they do a pretty good job. Like there are very rarely things in that first tab of the App Store that I look at and I see and that I'm like, if someone downloaded that they're going to have a bad experience. In the top charts area, it starts to get a lot more questionable. And there's a little bit of like self-filtering of that obviously people, in order to be on one of those lists, lots of people had to have thought that your app was good, but it starts to get more questionable. And then you get into the Explore tab, like that poor third tab in the App Store app, which has been 3 or 4 different things over the last 8 years and just feels like it's always turning over and it never quite finds its way. But, like that's the place that you'll start to very quickly kind of get into areas where it's the quality, or at least the robustness of those apps it becomes more and more problematic as you go. And it's like, maybe if Apple can't fix it on the review side, maybe it's just, let's just focus on editorial. Let's staff up dramatically, really go through the App Store. And it's like, if we think these apps aren't good, like maybe it's like we just flag them as such. And we say like, this is a B app and it's not going to show up in a certain places, or it's going to be very deprioritized in the way that people can find it, but it's still there. Like, I don't know. Is that better?
I hope they would do something like that behind the scenes, though I figure they probably aren't. But if they did, it would probably not be wise for us to know about that.
Sure.
Because I think that would cause issues. Ultimately, what we want Apple to do is to make it easier for apps like ours to be successful and to be found by people in the App Store. But it's worth challenging the assumption that our apps are better.
Sure.
If you look at what's actually in the App Store, and if you look at that top grossing list and you see what succeeds, it's probably hard for Apple to look at that and think they have to do anything differently than what they're doing now in like content choosing or steering the rules in such a way to encourage or discourage different types of apps than what they're getting now. Because what they're doing now is working very well, just not for people like us. But it's working very well for some people, and it's working very well by many metrics for Apple's customers. In the way that people are downloading a bunch of apps, they are playing these games and putting their coins in. It does work for a lot of people now, just not us. So is that really a problem? Like, do you think Apple sees it as a problem, and do you think it actually is a problem?
It's a tough question because it's really hard to separate, obviously, my own personal views and business from like sort of just like the more objective. If this was not what I did and I was just someone who just went to the Apple Store, bought an iPhone, and opened up the App Store. And it is definitely a trap. And I think you're sort of right to point it out in these types of discussions in our community, that you can very easily slip into the very subjective, just like indie apps are better kind of a mindset. And you end up with well, it's like if there's not a vibrant, independent community of app makers, that somehow the world is a sad and terrible place. And, and you could argue in some ways it's smaller companies tend to take bigger risks, and so more innovation happens, or those types of kind of more justifications. In some ways, what I hope is that if Apple is happy with the majority of sort of successful businesses in the App Store, or a lot of the money for the App Store, whatever, coming from those types of games, and or even just being game focused in general, that the majority, it's games and big companies. In the top 10 grossing apps, there are other things that aren't games. There's things like Spotify or services like that, big companies. The reality maybe is the hard thing to say to myself is, maybe that's fine with Apple and they're totally cool with that. And in some ways, their actions thus far would indicate that they are. And there's the sort of the introspection of saying, if that's the reality, it's am I just in the wrong place? At this point, it's not something that I really want to make a change about. I'm not saying oh, I want to get out of the App Store, but it's when I look at that, I'm maybe at some point I will have to, though, because it would just sort of not be economically viable to do what I do, and that would make me sad. But yeah, it's not up to me to decide what goes into the App Store, or what apps should the App Store be geared around making viable. Obviously, I'd like for it to be more viable for me, and I think you could make a reasonable argument that it's important to have some base level of the smaller developers like us kind of filling in cracks and pushing boundaries. And when new things come out, it's I've made my business in a lot of ways about watching Apple and how they push new technology out in their phones or in iOS, looking for new opportunities, and as soon as I can, jumping on those and being able to take advantage of being smaller and being able to make those kinds of decisions that maybe bigger companies can't. And that seems like a good thing, but it's certainly it's very selfish and self-centered to say if the App Store doesn't make my business model work, then it's not good.
The way that the App Store bothers me now, though, with what succeeds and what doesn't, not only from just an obvious envy that those aren't my apps in the top grossing position, but what bothers me that I think might be relevant here to Apple and to the users is that the apps that succeed today, I think, make the iPhone look a bit like a cheap flea market. It is not like a high fashion or a high quality branding angle that we see now today with all these basically casino games. They're not. This is not a classy, great experience for a lot of people, and it doesn't make Apple's products look good to know that most people are using them most of the time to throw coins into a psychologically abusive game that their friends and family made them obligated to play. I don't know it, and obviously people, it's a little bit snobby of me to say it because obviously a lot of people do enjoy these games and are perfectly fine with that, and I don't want to diminish their enjoyment of those, but do you think from Apple's point of view, do you think that's really what they want the iPhone to be in practice? Do they care, and does that really fit the way they want to brand this device?
I wouldn't think so. This is the funny thing of, I was a fan of Apple before I was an Apple developer. And the thing that I think is so, at a fundamental level, when I try and think of the things that I associate with Apple and with, sort of their brand more generally, is that there's a certain amount of trying to be more, it's more aspirational in the sense of they're trying to make it better. They're not just trying to make they're not trying to just make a basic works, is sufficient, is fine phone. They're trying to make the best of anything. And in most of the things that they do, whether or not they hit it or not is a whole other question. But, their goal, their mission is to make the best and to have, when you go into an Apple store, that you always come out with a good experience. It's not, they're not trying to be mediocre or sufficient. They're always trying to be better. And if you would apply that kind of mindset to the App Store, you would imagine you'd end up with a different App Store. You'd imagine if they're willing to take that risk of, they don't make the hundreds of different variations of the iPhone. They try and make one that's really, really good and is the best. And in the same way, it's like rather than trying to have all the different, it's like you go into an Apple store, it doesn't feel like going into Walmart. It's like the App Store is much more like going into Walmart or something like that.
Or worse.
But it's that kind of a feeling, right? It's like you go in and you see a charger, whatever, some iPhone accessory on the wall of an Apple Store, and you expect that is going to be good. It meets a certain basic level of criteria. Versus if you go into Walmart or you go into Amazon, and you're presented with probably 10 times the number of choices, you have a much harder decision, and you're in a harder position to make that choice because they haven't curated it for you. They haven't looked at it and said, we think these are the best, or these are the ones that you should try. And I would hope that if they did that same kind of mindset onto the App Store, that you could end up with a better experience and a better place, like overall, and one that would fit sort of like the Apple brand better. Like the Google Play Store, I think makes sense for Google. Like that's sort of their thing. It's like we index all the information everywhere. Like their sort of mindset around having a store that isn't strongly curated in the same way, like it seems like that would be a better fit potentially. But Apple could potentially take the other extreme and say, like, you know what, this is where we're going to go. And I think that would fit for them. And, ultimately, obviously, I would like that, I think.
I would too. I mean, like I was getting on a plane recently, and I wanted to download a whole bunch of like new good games, and seeing what was actually successful in the top charts, and just trying to find good games for myself to play on the plane. Like, if nothing else, the App Store should have tons of good games, right? But I honestly had a lot of trouble finding any that had any kind of depth whatsoever. Most of them are like, really like stupid, simple, like shallow things that like you play it for 10 seconds, you're like, oh, that's all it is. Okay. Like it was actually really hard to find good stuff. I feel like we need better stuff in the App Store, and we need Apple to think about how they can get better stuff in there, how they can incentivize and sustain the development of better apps, not just more apps.
Yeah, and I think there's some big problems here around, like it's like the old, what they call it, the broken window problem. Mm-hmm. Where you have, if you in a neighborhood, if you had a house that has sort of is derelict and has some broken windows in it, like it has this different other thing. It's like it starts to affect things that even aren't just that one house. It's like if the bar and the expectation for going to the App Store isn't high enough, it's going to have knock-on effects to lots of other apps, and other people, like you end up with customers who have different expectations. They'll look at the App Store and say, it's like you're more. It's like things like I think about like our discussion last week or about pricing, where it's harder in some ways to make to convince someone to have a paid upfront app and to download it. And in some of that, I could imagine is coming from a place of, there's a tremendous competition, which is sort of always going to have a downward pressure on pricing. But also, like if you don't have good expectations that what you're downloading is going to be good, is going to be worth it because you've been burned before, like that's going to discourage you from going ahead and downloading other apps and paying for them up front. And so you end up with more free apps. And if your app is free, then you have different, like you enter this kind of vicious cycle, because the amount of time that you're able, you sort of can justify putting into something, if you expect to only be able to make money back from it, either from consumable in a purchase, or even just like if you're just putting it out with ads in it, like you're sort of the value of each customer to you. And for the downside of having a customer have a bad experience, like it just continues to shrink down in kind of this negative cycle.
Exactly. All right, well, we're out of time today. I think we're going to continue this discussion next week, and with maybe some specific suggestions on like how Apple can really make the App Store better, specific areas that might be worth experimenting with. So thanks a lot for listening, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.